Hello and welcome to Betting People with this week's guest, Steve RYDER. Now, Steve is not only an owner and breeder, but he also writes for Oddschecker and he's the host and producer of the On the Hunt podcast. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Steve.
Thanks, William. Yeah, we've known each other a few years now, but it's nice to
We have indeed. We absolutely have indeed. Going on from that, though, one thing I don't know about you is how you got into racing. So I'd very much like to start with that.
So I live in a little village just outside Newmarket. So kind of growing up around horses and that sort of stuff. You can't really go around Newmarket without having to stop in traffic to be able to let the racehorses across the road. I suppose I really got into the horse racing side of it at university, just through the betting side of it. It was quite lucky that it was at the time where Frankel burst onto the scene. We went to Newmarket for the 2000 Guineas that year. It was 2011, and pretty much just followed him around the country on his remaining starts. So went to Goodwood for the Sussex Stakes against Camphor Cliffs, went for York for the Jugmont, and then went to Ascot for Champions Day, obviously on his final start. So that kind of helped along those way. I've obviously then gone to the Cheltenham Festival, and I'm actually really looking forward to it this year, going back to the July Cup. Got tickets for the Saturday, lucky enough to get those.
Oh, fantastic.
That'll actually be the first time that I'll be back on a racecourse since the Cheltenham Festival in 2020, which seemed absolutely
wow. Yeah, it really has been quite a time. I think there's many people who wouldn't have imagined the next time to get on a racecourse. I certainly didn't, but I went during the December period when we were suddenly allowed to go for a couple of days. Just for one thing, were you in a racing club at university, or?
No, it was purely down to the gambling side of it. One of my good friends there, was interested in the betting side of it. Kind of one of those things that at university you sit there, you do your football accumulators, and on those afternoons you sit and watch sport. And I think it was around the time of horse racing just being on terrestrial TV, which was obviously a bit of a godsend, really. And that's the way that I got into sport. So it's really good that the likes of ITV Racing have still obviously maintained that. And hopefully, they'll bring a fair few people into the sport that way.
Absolutely. The viewing figures are good on that front. I'm interested because you and I both got into punting sort of the same way. I certainly had my first punts at university. Were there any lessons that you learned when you started out at that time? Because I certainly feel there are some that I learned when I started out at that time.
I think it's from listening to people, but not relying on them. So there's so much content out there these days. There wasn't quite as much around the sort of 10 years ago that I kind of first got into it.
Yeah.
Now there's millions of podcasts, which we'll obviously go on to later, tipping columns and everything like that, where at the time you kind of had the Racing Post, Sporting Life. That was really about it. But I think as much as it can be with all these Cheltenham previews and that sort of stuff, like watch them, brilliant. Listen to people's opinions and then form your own opinion from there. Because a lot of people kind of will follow a certain tipster and just follow everything that they do. Whereas you kind of need to, I suppose, mold yourself around the best points of everyone. Everyone has their own kind of strategies and do's and don'ts, which I'm sure we'll go into. But it's kind of just developing your own way. And it will take years for you to do that. I lost a fair amount of money at the start from wrong information or doing the wrong sort of things. And you will go through that process. So if you're first starting out, keep your stakes small, learn the things that work for you, and then gradually up your stakes from there, because you will then become a successful punter and start losing your accounts.
Just two follow-on questions from there. Firstly, when did you start to turn a profit? Something I'm interested in.
I'd say probably about 2 or 3 years into it. I think everyone kind of remembers the successes early on. I remember backing this horse that won this and that. But realistically, if I'm being honest with myself, I was probably a losing punter for the first couple of years. And thankfully, I've learned lessons quickly, and the last few years have been very profitable for me.
And on the other side of that, what were the do's and don'ts that you learned early on?
It's not so much early on. I'm still adapting each day. We'll go on to. I've obviously run tipping columns and bits and pieces from there, but I think you've got to change the way that you, as the programs change, I suppose. So one of the main things that I've changed recently is since they've changed the program with reducing the number of maidens and more novice races. I think that's quite a good betting strategy from there. You genuinely have to be a group performer in these novice races to defy a penalty. So I much prefer looking at those races. Bookmakers automatically put in a horse that's won on their debut, generally in evens, maybe even shorter than that at odds on for these novice races. Whereas if you find a horse that's finished second, third, fourth on their debut, shaping like it will benefit from that experience, that's often a good strategy to go. Even more if you find a stable that don't particularly get them ready on debut. I find that a fantastic way through. If you actually go through John Gosden, I know we've had a look at stats and bits and pieces from him. He really struggles with horses in novice races under a penalty. Whereas I think if you look at the odds that those horses have gone off, the majority of them are kind of shorter than 6-4. So that's one of the recent changes in the program that I'll really get behind when having a look at tipping or punting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting angle. We've had lots of people on betting people who have certain angles into not only maidens and stuff, but other races too. Interesting in terms of approach to maidens and whatever. Are there particular races and particular types of contests that you prefer to go for, and are there also other races that you prefer to avoid when you're, I guess, backing and also tipping as you do for Oddschecker?
So I'm quite a big anti-post punter. So I like finding runners, trainer targets, bits and pieces like that. I don't often tip those because the majority of the time, obviously, there's not enough time to be able to get your bet on.
Have you found it to become impossible to do it in the same way that you might have? I don't know how long you've been going for Oddschecker, but it feels to me like there's been a sea change in what you can do the season before last compared to, say, 5 or 6 years ago in terms of anti-post. Has it become really, really difficult, almost impossible to make anti-post pay over the last few years?
No, so I'll still happily punt anti-post and happily make a profit on it. I just don't feel like I can do that in the facility of tipping to people. I used to write a Wednesday column for bookmakers.co.uk, and every week I'd then be tipping 3 or 4 horses for the weekend there. That was okay a couple of years ago, but at the minute they're so volatile, the markets, that even a few bets will reduce a horse's odds, and then actually I might look at the race and something else has become the value in that race because of the changes in those odds. So yes, I'll punt anti-post, and yes, I'll make a profit anti-post, but for a tipping facility, to be able to help other punters, it just doesn't work anymore. Bookmakers just cut prices so quickly. If you've got a nugget of information that a certain horse isn't running or a certain horse is running, normally you've got kind of a 10-15 minute interval where you can get your bet on before the markets will react.
And sort of coming to the end of this period, but for people who might just be starting out in terms of their punting, what advice would you give them?
Personally, a few other strategies that I look at, I place a lot of importance on course and distance form, looking at specific tracks. So if you find a track that suits a certain horse, or that's quite a quirky horse, a quirky race horse,
like a Chester or something.
Chester, Epsom, Pontefract, tight turns, Cartmel over jumps, even sort of Newmarket on the sprint distances with going into the dip and horses handling that. If a horse has got course and distance form over there, it means a lot. So I'll have a look back at their form, and if they've had course and distance form over there, not even just course and distance winning form, just course and distance form, it really does mean a lot. I also like horses on handicap debut with things that are different. So a horse is on handicap debut. If you look at a horse that has had 3 runs and it's in a race on its handicap debut against exposed rivals around 20 odd times, the handicapper knows how good they are. If you've got a horse going into that handicap, they've come into there and they've been fitted with first time headgear, they've been gelded, they're up in trip. So Sir Mark Prescott is obviously well known for doing this, running horses over 6-7 furlongs up to 1.5 miles on handicap debut, bang, go straight in. Horses that have had a break, so they've ran 3 times as 2-year-olds, come back on their 3-year-old handicap debut after a 200 odd day break. They've had so much improvement over that time, and often you can find a stable that aren't quite as well found in the market as the Sir Mark Prescott horse, and make that pay. So Sir Mark Prescott generally open about 6-4. That can be valuable on some horses that then rack up the secrets of 6 wins, going up from 1.2 miles, 1.4 miles, 1.6 miles, 2 miles. But there are other trainers that are very, very good at that. With regards to headgear, I like switches in headgear with specific trainers. So one recent example of last season was Captain Chaos. Captain Chaos ran without headgear, was held up in a few races, dropped down the handicap, bang, classic chase, blinkers back on, prominent ride, and he went close and ended up winning on his next start after that. So there are certain angles with headgear that I will have a look at as well.
Thank you very much, and really interesting points, and part 1 of this Betting interview with you, Steve Ryder. Thank you very much.